She was standing on the deck of a rusted houseboat at the far end of a dock she had never seen before, holding a key that a stranger had just placed in her hand. And the sun was going down behind the cypress trees in a way that made the bayou look like it was on fire. She owned nothing except what she could carry: a backpack with a broken zipper, a canvas duffel bag her father had used for laundry, a Folgers coffee can with $1,130 inside, which was every dollar she had earned in 3 years of weekend work at a marine supply store in Mississippi. She had just spent 10 of those dollars on the boat beneath her feet. The hull was steel-painted white sometime during the Carter administration, now mostly rust with patches of bare metal showing through like bone under skin. The cabin was wood turquoise, once peeling, now the paint curling away from the planks in long strips that looked like birch bark. Two small windows on each side fogged with age and salt residue. A life ring hung crooked on the railing, its rope rotted but still attached, as if the boat itself hadn't given up on the idea of rescue even after everyone else had. The marina owner had told her she'd be lucky if it stayed afloat for a month. The man who sold it to her, a boat mechanic named Declan, who looked like his brother, but with a beard and fewer words, had said nothing about luck. He had asked her 3 technical questions and handed her the key when she answered all 3 correctly. She was 19 years old. She had no family she could go back to, and below the deck of that old houseboat, hidden in a compartment that hadn't been opened in over 40 years, was something that would change the shape of her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. But that discovery was still a morning away. First there was the night, and before the night, there was everything that had brought her here, a chain of losses and small stubborn choices that stretched back to a kitchen drawer in central Mississippi, where a woman who had been dead for 8 years had once kept a folder full of crayon boats drawn by a girl who had never seen the sea. Lena Calloway was born in a town so small that the post office and the hardware store shared a building, and the nearest body of water was a muddy farm pond behind the Gentry property, where cattle stood knee-deep in summer and mosquitoes bred in clouds so thick they looked like weather. The nearest river was 40 miles east. The nearest coast was 200 miles south. Nobody in her family owned a boat. Nobody in her family had ever owned a boat. Her father, Hank, had grown up in the same town, married a woman from 3 towns over, and settled into a life defined by proximity. Everything he needed was within a 20-mile radius, and he saw no reason to expand it. But Lena drew boats. She drew them before she knew what they were called, before she understood that the shapes in her head corresponded to real objects that floated on real water. She drew them with crayons on construction paper in kindergarten, with markers on the backs of grocery receipts, with pencils on the blank pages at the end of her school notebooks. Sailboats with crooked masts and stick figure sailors waving from the decks. Tugboats with smokestacks like birthday candles. Houseboats with flowers in window boxes and cats asleep on the roofs. She drew them constantly, compulsively, the way some children draw horses or dinosaurs or castles, except that horses and dinosaurs and castles were things those children had seen in books or movies or museums, and Lena had never seen a boat in person. Not once. Not a canoe at a summer camp she couldn't afford. Not a fishing boat at a lake she had never visited. The boats in her head came from somewhere she couldn't name, and they arrived fully formed, as real to her as the kitchen table where she sat drawing them every afternoon after school. Her mother, Ruth, was the kind of woman who noticed things without making a fuss about them. She noticed that her daughter's drawings were always boats. She noticed that the boats got more detailed as Lena got older by 7. The stick figure sailors had hands and faces by 8. The hulls had waterlines and rudders by 9. The sails had rigging and the masts had stays. She noticed all of this, and she did not ask why or suggest that Lena draw something else, or wonder aloud whether there was something odd about a landlocked girl in central Mississippi who could not stop drawing vessels meant for water she had never touched. What Ruth did was save them. Every drawing, every crumpled piece of construction paper, every grocery receipt, every torn-out notebook page. She kept them in a manila folder in the kitchen drawer, the one next to the silverware, and she added to it quietly without ceremony. The way a person deposits money into an account, they plan to leave untouched for a long time. By the time Lena was 9, the folder was an inch thick. One afternoon in the summer, Lena turned 9, a Sunday, hot, the kind of Mississippi heat that makes the air visible, shimmering above the road like a second atmosphere. She and her mother sat on the front porch. Lena was drawing a sailboat. This one was different from the others. It had a dark hull and a low cabin, and no mast at all, just a flat roof with what looked like a solar panel, though Lena didn't know the word for that yet. It wasn't going anywhere. It was sitting still, floating at rest. Ruth watched her draw for a while without speaking. Then she leaned over and looked at the picture the way she always looked at Lena's drawings. Not as a mother indulging a child's hobby, but as a person studying something she found genuinely interesting. Her voice was casual, almost idle, the way you ask a question when you already suspect the answer. "Where do you want to go on all these boats of yours?" Lena didn't look up. Her crayon moved across the paper, filling in the hull with the color she always chose, a blue so dark it was almost black. "I don't want to go anywhere. I just want to be on the boat." Ruth was quiet for a moment. The cicadas sang. A truck passed on the road trailing dust. Then her mother spoke again, and the words settled into Lena the way certain sentences do when you're young. You don't understand them. You can't use them yet. But you store them somewhere deep because some part of you recognizes that they're true in a way you'll need later. Maybe that's right. Maybe some people don't need to go anywhere. They just need to find the right place to be. Lena kept drawing. The conversation ended there the way conversations between mothers and young daughters sometimes do, mid-thought, mid-afternoon, suspended in the heat, like the shimmer above the road, unfinished but complete. She would not understand what her mother meant for another 10 years. But she would carry the sentence with her every day of those 10 years, even after the woman who said it was gone. Ruth Calloway died on a Tuesday in October when Lena was 11. Brain aneurysm. She was standing at the kitchen counter making dinner. Chicken and rice, Lena's favorite, the rice already measured into the pot. The chicken thighs seasoned and waiting on a plate when something in her brain that had been silently weakening for years, or maybe for her entire life, gave way. She collapsed between the counter and the stove. Hank found her when he came in from the garage. The ambulance arrived in 14 minutes. By Wednesday morning, she was on life support. By Thursday afternoon, she was gone. 41 years old. No warning, no symptoms. No time to say anything to anyone about anything that mattered. Lena came home from school on Tuesday to a house full of neighbors she barely knew, and a father sitting on the couch with a face she had never seen before. Not sad exactly, but emptied, as if someone had reached inside him and removed the part that knew how to be present. The neighbors brought casseroles and spoke in low voices and told Lena things that were meant to be comforting, but weren't. She's in a better place now. Time heals all wounds. God has a plan. Lena stood in the kitchen doorway and heard these sentences and understood with the clarity that children sometimes have about language that every single one of them was a lie. Not a malicious lie, a helpless one. The kind people tell when they have nothing true to offer, and silence feels worse than dishonesty. The funeral was on Saturday. Lena wore a dress she hated, black, with a white collar borrowed from a neighbor's daughter. She sat in the front pew of a church she attended only at Christmas and Easter, and watched a minister who had met her mother exactly twice describe her as a woman of faith and grace. The minister was not wrong, but he was not right either. He was describing a category: good Christian woman, devoted wife, loving mother, and Ruth Calloway had been all of those things. But she had also been a person who sat on a porch on a hot Sunday and asked her daughter about crayon boats, and listened to the answer with genuine interest. And that was the thing about her that mattered most. And the minister didn't know it, and nobody in the church knew it except Lena and the folder in the kitchen drawer. A week after the funeral, Lena went to the kitchen drawer. She needed the folder. She needed to hold the drawings to feel the weight of them, to remind herself that her mother had seen her not the category of her, not the daughter-shaped outline, but the actual specific girl who drew boats and wanted to be on the water without knowing why. The folder was there. She pulled it out and opened it on the kitchen table and began to look through the drawings one by one, starting from the earliest crayon scrawls and working forward through markers and pencils to the more careful sketches she had done at 8 and 9. And between 2 pages between a crayon tugboat from first grade and a pencil schooner from third, she found a small piece of paper torn from a spiral notebook, written on in blue ballpoint ink in her mother's handwriting. 5 words, no date, no signature, no context. Just the sentence as if Ruth had written it quickly. Maybe on a whim, maybe after thinking about it for a long time, and tucked it into the folder, the way you tuck a seed into soil, not knowing when it would be found or if it would grow, but trusting that it belonged there. Lena will find her water. Lena read the note 3 times. She pressed it flat against the kitchen table with both palms. Then she folded it carefully twice until it was small enough to fit in the coin pocket of the wallet she had gotten for her 10th birthday. And she put it there. And she zipped the pocket shut. And she carried it with her every day for the next 8 years, without showing it to anyone or speaking about it out loud. Her father did not shatter after Ruth died. He did something worse. He dimmed. The way a fire goes out not all at once with a dramatic collapse of logs and a shower of sparks, but slowly ember by ember, the orange fading to red and the red fading to gray, and the gray fading to nothing, until what's left is a shape that looks like a fire but holds no heat and gives no light. Hank Calloway was a maintenance worker at the town's only high school. He fixed leaky faucets and replaced ceiling tiles and unjammed locker doors and changed the fluorescent bulbs in the gymnasium. He was good at his job in the way that quiet, methodical men are good at jobs that require patience and repetition. He showed up, he did the work, he didn't complain. People in town described him with a phrase that was always delivered with a slight downward tilt of the head, a small sympathetic lowering of the voice. He does his best. It was meant kindly. It was also, Lena would later realize, a way of saying that his best was not quite enough, without having to say it directly. The first year after Ruth died, Hank still cooked dinner. He had never been the cook in the family. Ruth had handled meals the way she handled most things, quietly and well, but he tried. The meals got simpler. 3 dishes became 2, 2 became 1. By the end of the first year, dinner was usually a can of something heated on the stove and served on paper plates, because Hank had stopped washing dishes and Lena was 11 and didn't know yet that you could take over a household task without being asked. Ruth's plate stayed on the kitchen table for 2 months. The same white plate with the blue rim, the one Ruth had always used sitting at her place at the table, as if she might walk in from the kitchen any moment and sit down. Lena was the one who finally put it away. She washed it carefully, dried it with a towel, and set it in the back of the cabinet behind the other plates. Hank didn't mention it. He may not have noticed. Or he may have noticed and been grateful and been unable to say so. With Hank toward the end, it was impossible to tell the difference between not noticing and not being able to speak. The 3rd year. Lena was 14. Hank stopped sitting down for dinner. He ate standing up in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with his plate in one hand, looking out the window at the backyard where nothing was happening. Chewing slowly and swallowing like a man performing a task he no longer remembered the reason for. Lena sat at the table alone, hearing the sound of her father's fork against his plate through the wall that separated the kitchen from the dining area. And she understood that they had become 2 people living in the same house rather than a family living in a home. The 5th year. Lena was 16. Hank stopped talking in anything longer than single syllables. Yeah. Fine. Go to bed. Lena would come home from school and tell him about her day, and he would nod and answer in monosyllables and look past her at something only he could see, not the wall behind her, not the window, Not any physical object, but some interior landscape that had swallowed him gradually, the way kudzu swallows a fence post growing over it so slowly you don't notice until the shape beneath is gone. She tried. She tried the way children of slowly departing parents try, with small, hopeful gestures that cost her more than she could afford emotionally, and that failed so gently each time that the failure itself became a kind of education. When she was 16, she bought 2 tickets to a Mississippi State football game in Jackson. She had earned the money herself, $32 total, from the job she had just gotten at the marine supply store. She put the tickets on the kitchen table with a note, "For us, Saturday." Hank picked them up, looked at them, turned them over, set them back down. His voice was far away, the voice of a man speaking from the bottom of a well. "Thank you, sweetheart." He walked to his bedroom and closed the door. Saturday came. He didn't mention the tickets. Lena didn't remind him. The tickets sat on the kitchen table through Saturday and Sunday and Monday, and on Tuesday morning before the school bus came. Lena picked them up and dropped them in the trash can under the sink. That was the last time she tried to pull her father back. Not because she stopped loving him. She never stopped loving him. But because trying and failing is a specific kind of pain, sharp and active, and at some point, the body's self-preservation instinct kicks in and converts it to a different kind of pain, dull and passive, the kind you can live with because you have no choice. Lena chose the version she could survive. By the 7th year, when she was 18, Hank Calloway was a shell. He still drove to the high school every morning. He still fixed faucets and replaced tiles and changed bulbs. He still came home and ate dinner standing in the kitchen and watched the evening news in his recliner and went to bed at 9:30. From the outside, his life looked like a life. But Lena knew, and the town knew, and even Hank probably knew, though he couldn't have said it, and maybe couldn't even have thought it clearly, that the man inside the routine had been gone for a long time. She got the job at the marine supply store the summer she turned 16. It was an hour away by bus on the outskirts of Jackson, a small cinder block building with a corrugated metal roof and a gravel parking lot, and a hand-painted sign that read, "Gulf Coast Marine Supply," which was optimistic, given that the Gulf Coast was 200 miles south, and the store's primary customers were base fishermen from the surrounding counties who needed hooks and line and maybe a trolling motor once a year. But the store smelled right. That was what Lena noticed first, before the inventory or the layout or the man behind the counter. The store smelled like fiberglass resin and rope, and something faintly briny like the ghost of salt water carried inland by the products themselves. The marine-grade hardware, the stainless steel cleats and chocks, the coils of nylon dock line that had been manufactured somewhere near the coast and still held the memory of it in their fibers. The man behind the counter was Emmett. He was in his early 60s, silver-haired with hands the size of small shovels and a manner that was blunt without being unkind. He had been a rescue swimmer for the United States Coast Guard in the 1980s. The kind of man who jumped out of helicopters into 30-foot seas to pull drowning people onto baskets, and he had retired to Mississippi with a bad knee and a good pension, and opened the marine supply store because he needed something to do with his hands and his knowledge, and the part of his brain that never stopped thinking about boats. He didn't feel sorry for Lena. That was the first thing she noticed about him, and it was the thing that made her trust him. Everyone else in her life looked at her with a particular tilt of the head. The sympathy tilt, the "oh, that poor girl" angle, and she hated it not because the sympathy was insincere, but because it was useless. Sympathy didn't fix anything. It just acknowledged that things were broken and then left them that way. Emmett didn't tilt his head. He looked at her straight on and asked if she knew what a shackle was. She didn't. He showed her. Then he asked if she could remember the difference between a shackle and a turnbuckle by tomorrow. She could. Then he asked if she wanted to come back Saturday and learn the inventory system. She did. Within 6 months, Lena had memorized the parts catalog, all 400 pages of it. Organized by category, cross-referenced by manufacturer, With part numbers, she could recite from memory the way some people recite phone numbers or Bible verses. She learned the difference between marine epoxy and regular epoxy. Marine epoxy was formulated to cure underwater, to bond to wet surfaces, to resist salt water and ultraviolet light. Regular epoxy was for fixing a broken chair leg. Using regular epoxy on a boat was like using a Band-Aid on a broken arm. It would cover the problem without fixing it, and eventually the problem would come back worse than before. She learned what a stuffing box was, the fitting that seals the propeller shaft where it passes through the hull, preventing water from entering the boat through the hole that the shaft requires. A small piece of engineering. That was when you thought about it. The only thing standing between a boat and the ocean that wanted to get inside it. She learned what a bilge pump did. It removed the water that inevitably collected in the lowest part of the hull. The bilge, the dark space beneath the floorboards where gravity pulled everything that leaked or seeped or condensed. She learned why fiberglass needed gel coat, the smooth, glossy outer layer that protected the structural fiberglass from water absorption, and UV degradation, the skin of the boat without which the body underneath would slowly weaken and rot. She learned that ropes on a boat were called lines, that the front of a boat was the bow and the back was the stern, and the left side was port, and the right side was starboard. That floors were decks and walls were bulkheads and stairs were companionways, and the kitchen was a galley, and the bathroom was a head. Everything had a specific name, and the names mattered because in an emergency, water coming in, fire breaking out, a man overboard in cold water at night, you didn't have time to point and say that thing over there. You said the word and everyone who heard it knew exactly what you meant, and exactly where to go and exactly what to do. Emmett taught her things that went beyond inventory and terminology. He taught her to splice a line, to weave the strands of a rope back into itself to create a permanent loop, or to join two lines together. A skill that required patience and finger strength, and the ability to visualize three-dimensional geometry in your hands. He taught her to read a tide chart to understand how the moon's gravity pulled the ocean up and down the shore twice a day, and how that rhythm affected everything from dock height to channel depth to the feeding patterns of fish. He taught her to identify a boat by its hull, design displacement hull or planing hull, full keel or fin keel, round bottom or flat bottom. Each shape built for a different purpose, a different kind of water, a different relationship between the vessel and the element it moved through. And then one afternoon, while they were closing up the store, counting the register, sweeping the floor, Emmett said something that Lena would carry with her as carefully as she carried her mother's note. He wasn't looking at her when he said it. He was looking at the pegboard on the wall where the marine hardware hung in neat rows, cleats and chocks and hinges and hasps, each one designed to solve a specific problem on a specific part of a boat. A boat is a system, every part connected to every other part. Hull holds the water out. Bilge pump handles what gets through. Engine moves you forward. Rudder points you where you need to go. Fuel system feeds the engine. Electrical system runs the lights and the pumps and the instruments. Plumbing keeps the water where it belongs. Every piece has a job, and if one piece fails, it affects every other piece because that's what systems do. He turned from the pegboard and looked at her. A system can be fixed if you understand how it works. And understanding how a system works is the most useful skill a person can have. Because everything in life is a system. Houses, cars, people, weather, money. If you can see the system, you can fix the system. If you can't see it, you're at its mercy. Lena thought about that for a long time. She thought about her father, who was a system that had lost a critical component, her mother, and had been failing ever since, one subsystem at a time. The way a boat with a cracked hull takes on water slowly. The bilge pump running harder and harder to keep up until the pump itself burns out and the water rises and the boat goes down, not with a crash, but with a long, slow quiet settling into the dark. Emmett had a boat behind the store. Not a boat for sale, a boat for teaching. A 14-foot aluminum skiff with a dead outboard motor, a cracked hull, a rotted seat, and a bilge full of leaves and rainwater. It sat on a trailer with flat tires behind the dumpster, and it had been there for years, and nobody had asked about it, and Emmett had never offered it to anyone. But one Saturday afternoon, after Lena had been working at the store for about 4 months, he walked her around the back and pointed at it. "That boat hasn't run in 6 years. The motor's seized. The hull has 2 holes. The wiring is mouse-chewed. I want you to fix it." He didn't say when. He didn't say how. He didn't offer to help. He just pointed at the boat and walked back inside the store. Lena spent the next 2 years fixing that boat. Every Saturday and Sunday after her shift at the store, she stayed late and worked on the skiff. She patched the hull holes with aluminum sheet and pop rivets, grinding the edges smooth with a file and sealing them with marine sealant. She pulled the outboard motor apart piece by piece: carburetor, fuel pump, ignition, coil, spark plugs, water pump, impeller, laying each component out on a clean tarp on the ground. In the order she removed it, photographing each step with a disposable camera so she could reassemble in reverse. She cleaned the carburetor with solvent until the jets were clear. She replaced the fuel lines, which had hardened and cracked. She replaced the impeller, which had lost 2 of its rubber blades. She replaced the spark plugs and the ignition coil and the pull start rope. She chased the mouse-chewed wiring through the hull, cutting out the damaged sections and splicing in new marine-grade cable, heat-shrinking each connection and running the new wire through protective conduit so no mouse would ever get to it again. She scraped the hull. She sanded the hull. She primed the hull. She painted the hull white 2 coats with the marine enamel that Emmett let her take from the store at cost. She replaced the rotted seat with a new one she built from marine plywood and teak trim, cutting the plywood on Emmett's table saw and rotating the edges smooth. She rebuilt the transom where the motor mounted, reinforcing it with a doubler plate of aluminum because the original had been weakened by years of vibration and corrosion. It took almost 2 years. Some weekends she made no progress at all. She would discover a problem inside a problem, a corroded bolt inside a frozen fitting, inside a cracked housing, and she would spend the entire day just getting one bolt free. Other weekends, she would leap forward, installing a new component and hearing it click into place with the satisfying precision of something engineered to fit exactly where it was going. The motor was the hardest part. She rebuilt it 3 times before it ran. The first time it fired for 2 seconds and died. The second time it ran for a minute and then overheated because the water pump wasn't circulating coolant properly. The third time, after she replaced a gasket she had missed. It caught on the first pull and ran and kept running rough at first and then smoother as the fuel flowed and the cylinders found their rhythm and the sound of it, that outboard motor sound, that buzzing, mechanical purr, was the most beautiful thing Lena had ever heard. On the day the boat was finished, Emmett closed the store at noon. He loaded the skiff onto a borrowed trailer and drove Lena 30 miles to Ross Barnett Reservoir, a large lake north of Jackson. They backed the trailer down the concrete ramp. The boat slid into the water and floated. It didn't leak. The hull patches held. The paint gleamed. Emmett stood on the ramp with his arms crossed while Lena stepped aboard. She sat on the seat she had built. She squeezed the fuel primer bulb 3 times. She set the choke. She pulled the starter rope. The motor caught on the second pull and settled into a steady idle, pushing a small fan of water out from the lower unit. Lena shifted into forward gear. The boat moved. She steered it away from the ramp, out past the dock, into the open water of the reservoir. And for the first time in her life, she was on a boat, not drawing one, not stocking parts for one, not reading about one in a manual at the kitchen table, but standing on a vessel that was floating on water. A vessel she had built from a wreck with her own hands over 2 years of weekends while her father stared at the television, and the town felt sorry for her. And nobody except a retired Coast Guard rescue swimmer in a cinderblock store on the outskirts of Jackson believed she was capable of anything that mattered. She didn't cheer. She didn't cry. She stood on the boat with her hand on the throttle and looked at the water stretching out ahead of her. and felt something shift in her chest, a recognition, a lock turning. The crayon drawings in the kitchen drawer were not fantasies. They were blueprints. Emmett stood on the ramp with his arms still crossed. He watched the boat move across the reservoir, trailing a small wake. He nodded once. When Lena brought the boat back in, he helped her winch it onto the trailer without saying a word. They drove back to the store in silence. At the parking lot, as Lena was getting out of the truck to catch the bus home, Emmett spoke. I have a brother, name's Declan. He runs a marine repair shop on the Bayou outside Houma, Louisiana. If you ever want to learn boats from the inside out, not from catalogs, not from a dead skiff behind a dumpster, but from the real thing, the water, the weather, the work, he'll teach you. He's not friendly, but he's fair. Lena thanked him. She didn't plan to take him up on it. She had a job, a father, a house, a life in Mississippi, small and damaged as it was. Louisiana was a word on a map, not a plan. But seeds don't always grow on schedule. Some of them wait. Lena kept every dollar she earned at the marine supply store in the Folgers coffee can in the back of her closet. The can was red and smelled faintly of grounds no matter how many times she washed it. By the time she was 18, the can held $880. By the time she was 19, it held $1,140. She knew the exact amount because she counted it every Sunday night sitting cross-legged on her bed, with the can between her knees, stacking the bills by denomination and counting them twice. The money was not for anything specific. It was for the future, which was itself not specific. It was a weight in her hands that proved the present was real and that she had some small measure of control over what came next. Hank Calloway died on his daughter's 19th birthday. Heart attack. He was sitting in his recliner watching the evening news. The same recliner, the same news, the same posture. He had assumed every evening for 8 years. The posture of a man who had found a position that required nothing of him and had committed to it with the dedication of a monk. The television was tuned to the local affiliate. The volume was low. The weather forecast was showing a cold front moving through central Mississippi, temperatures dropping into the 40s by morning. Lena came home from the marine supply store at 6:30. She opened the front door. The television was on. Her father was in his chair. She knew before she crossed the room. She knew the way you know when a house is empty, even though you can see a person in it. Something about the quality of the silence, the way the air sits when there is no breathing to move it. She walked to the recliner and looked at her father's face. He looked peaceful. That was a strange thing to feel grateful for, but she felt it anyway. He hadn't suffered. He hadn't struggled. He had just stopped the way she had been watching him stop for 8 years, except now the stopping was complete, and there was nothing left to slow down. She called 911. She sat with him until the paramedics came. She answered their questions. She signed the papers. She called the funeral home that had handled her mother's arrangements 8 years earlier. The same funeral home, the same building, a different director, because the old one had retired. She did all of this without crying, without shaking, without any visible sign of distress that the paramedics or the neighbors or the funeral director could identify, and this was not because she didn't feel anything. It was because she had been practicing for this moment for 8 years, watching her father die incrementally, and the final event was not a shock. It was an arrival. The funeral was small. The same church, the same minister, a different dress. This one, her own black, bought at the Goodwill in Jackson 2 years earlier for a school event she never attended. The minister described Hank Calloway as a devoted father and a faithful member of the community. And again, the words were not wrong, but they were not the whole truth either. And Lena sat in the front pew and let them wash over her like water over a hull. After the service, she went home and began packing. She packed her father's clothes into boxes for Goodwill, his shoes, his work boots, his one suit. She packed his books. He had only 3, a Bible, a fishing guide, and a Tom Clancy novel with a cracked spine that he had been reading for as long as Lena could remember, without ever finishing. She packed everything with the efficiency of someone who has had time to prepare, which she had years of time, more time than anyone should need, to prepare for a loss that is coming, as surely and slowly as a tide. She kept his old wool fishing sweater, dark green, smelling of him soap and machine oil, and something else, something warmer. The smell of a man who had once been whole. She kept the framed photograph from the bedroom dresser, her mother and father, in 1998, standing in front of a restaurant in Jackson, where they had gone for their anniversary. Both of them smiling, her mother's hand on her father's chest, her father's arm around her mother's shoulder. Two people who looked like they had figured out something important about being alive. And then she opened her father's closet to clear out the last of his things, and she found it. The manila folder, the one from the kitchen drawer, the one her mother had kept the crayon boats in. It was there in the back of Hank Calloway's closet, behind a stack of folded work shirts on the shelf where he kept his extra shoelaces and his watch box and the small things a man accumulates when his life is narrow and routine. Ruth's folder, Lena's drawings, moved from the kitchen drawer to the bedroom closet at some point in the last 8 years. Lena didn't know when, couldn't know when, might have been the week after Ruth died, or the year after, or last month, and kept there silently by a man who could not speak to his daughter about the things that mattered, but who had carried her crayon boats from room to room, the way a man carries a photograph of someone he has lost. Lena opened the folder. The drawings were all there. Every crayon boat, every marker tugboat, every pencil schooner. And some of the pages had marks on them. Not watermarks from a leaky roof, not coffee stains, but smaller marks, the kind of marks that come from being held. The edges of certain pages were soft from handling. The corners of certain drawings were rounded the way paper gets when it is picked up and put down and picked up again over a long period of time. Her father had looked at these drawings, not once, not twice, but repeatedly, regularly, the way a person returns to something that means more to them than they can say. Lena sat on the edge of her father's bed and held the folder in her lap and understood something that rearranged the last 8 years of her life. Her father had not been empty. He had not been absent. He had been present in the only way he knew how, silently, invisibly, in a closet in the dark, holding his dead wife's folder full of his living daughter's drawings, and being unable to close the distance between what he felt and what he could express. He had loved her. He had been loving her the whole time. He just hadn't known how to make the love visible, and she hadn't known where to look. She put the folder in her backpack. She put everything else in the Goodwill boxes. She zipped the backpack shut. Grady, the landlord, came by 2 days after the funeral. He was a man in his 60s who owned 3 houses in town and rented them to people who paid on time and didn't complain. He was not unkind. He stood on the porch with his hat in his hands and told Lena he had a daughter of his own who needed the house and the rent was paid through the end of the month, and 2 weeks was the best he could do. Lena nodded. She had expected it. The house had never been hers. It had been a container for a family that no longer existed, and containers get repurposed. On the morning the lease ended, Lena stood on the front porch with her backpack and her duffel bag and her coffee can with $1,130 inside. She looked at the door for a long moment. The same door she had walked through 10,000 times. The door her mother had opened, and closed the door her father had locked every night, with the same deliberate turn of the deadbolt. Then she pulled it shut and walked to the bus station. The bus to Jackson left at 9:15. The bus from Jackson to Baton Rouge left at 11:40. Lena had been thinking about Louisiana for months, not as a plan, not as a destination, but as a direction, the way a compass needle points south without knowing what south contains. Emmett's brother, Declan, a marine repair shop on the Bayou outside Houma, if you ever want to learn boats from the inside out. Standing in the Jackson bus station with everything she owned in 2 bags and a coffee can, Lena realized she had nothing else to point toward. No family, no house, no plan, no anchor. Just a direction and a name and a sentence her mother had written on a scrap of notebook paper 8 years ago. She bought the ticket. The ride south was long. Mississippi rolled into Louisiana as the land flattened and the air thickened and the sky lowered until it seemed to rest on the treetops like a gray wool blanket. The trees changed. Oaks giving way to bald cypress and tupelo, their trunks swelling at the base, their roots reaching into dark water that stood motionless between the trees, like something that had been poured and then forgotten. Spanish moss hung from the branches in long gray curtains, swaying slightly in a breeze that smelled like mud and vegetation and the faintest trace of salt. Lena watched it all through the bus window with the kind of attention she gave to anything she was trying to learn. This was a landscape she had never visited, but had somehow been expecting: the flatness, the water, the heaviness of the air, the way the trees stood in the water, like patient animals waiting for something only they understood. She arrived in Houma at dusk. The bus station was a small concrete building beside a gas station. The air outside the bus was warm and wet and heavy, like breathing through a damp washcloth. Insects sang in the weeds beside the parking lot. A dog barked somewhere behind the gas station, and a dented Ford F250 Primer Grey on the fenders and rust on the wheel wells sat idling near the curb with a man behind the wheel who looked exactly like Emmett, but with a beard and 10 fewer pounds of muscle. Declan. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't shake her hand. He leaned across the truck's bench seat, pushed the passenger door open with one long arm, and jerked his chin toward the seat. Lena climbed in. He pulled away from the curb before she had her seatbelt on. They drove with one hand on the wheel and one elbow out the window, and Declan let the warm, wet evening air fill the cab of the truck and didn't say a word for the first 10 minutes. The road narrowed. The trees closed in. Streetlights gave way to darkness, and the headlights carved a tunnel through the hanging moss. And the road became gravel, and the gravel became dirt, and the dirt became two ruts through tall grass that ended at a wooden building with a corrugated metal roof and a single floodlight on a pole and a dock that extended into water so dark it looked like the ground had simply stopped. Declan killed. The engine stepped out and stood at the edge of the dock with his hands in his pockets. Lena followed. A handful of boats were tied along the dock. A fishing skiff with a casting platform, a cabin cruiser with weed-streaked sides, and a for sale sign taped to the windshield with a price so low it was almost an apology. An aluminum John boat with a dented bow, and at the far end, listing slightly to port low in the water, heavy with years and whatever was inside her, a houseboat. Declan pointed at it with his chin the way he had pointed at the truck seat. Old Harlan Thibodaux's place. He died last year. No family. Nobody claimed it. Marina was going to sell her for scrap, but I told them I'd hold her. Emmett said you might be looking for something. Lena walked down the dock. She stopped at the end and looked at the houseboat the way Emmett had taught her to look at boats, not at the surface, not at the rust and the peeling paint and the general air of abandonment, but at the structure underneath. The hull was steel about 30 feet long, painted white, originally now wearing its rust like a second skin, patches of bare metal showing through where the paint had given up. The cabin sat on top of the hull, a flat-roofed wooden structure, loaded turquoise paint peeling in long strips. Two small windows on each side filmed over with grime and mineral deposits. A wooden door facing the dock, weathered to silver, the hardware green with oxidation. A life ring hung on the railing, tilted, its rope rotted, but still knotted to the stanchion. But she could see the lines. She could see what the boat had been and what it could be again. The hull was steel, which meant it could be patched and sanded and painted. Steel rusted, but steel was strong. And rust was a surface problem, not a structural one, as long as you caught it before it ate through. The cabin was wood, which meant it could be replaced board by board if necessary. Every plank, every beam, every piece of trim until the cabin was new, but the boat was still the same boat. The shape was good, low and stable, a wide beam for her length, designed not for speed or distance, but for stillness, for floating, for staying in one place on slow water, without fighting the current or the wind. How much? Declan scratched his beard. Harlan owed back fees on the slip. Marina was going to take what they could get. The fees came to $10 even. Lena set her duffel bag on the dock. She unzipped the side pocket and took out the Folgers can. She pried off the plastic lid. She counted 10 $1 bills from the roll inside and placed them one by one onto Declan's open palm. He looked at the money. He looked at her. He closed his hand. You know how to call Kasim? Yes. You know how to mix marine epoxy? Yes. You know what to do if you find a hull breach below the waterline. Pump the bilge. Identify the source. Patch from outside if you can, from inside if you can't, with thickened epoxy and a wood backer. Declan smiled. It was the first time, and it changed his face entirely. The beard splitting open to reveal teeth and warmth, and something that might have been surprise. Emmett said you knew your stuff. I didn't believe him. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a key, a single brass key on a plain steel ring, tarnished but solid. He held it out. Sleep on her tonight. We'll start in the morning. Lena took the key. She walked to the end of the dock. She stepped onto the houseboat. The deck creaked under her weight, but held. She unlocked the cabin door and pushed it open and stepped inside. A single small room, maybe 10 feet by 12. A built-in bunk along one wall, the mattress rotted and stained the color of old tea. A small galley with a propane stove that had corroded into a sculpture of its former self. A table bolted to the floor, and 2 folding chairs, one of them missing a leg. Cabinets along the wall's doors, hanging open shelves, empty except for a coffee mug and a can of WD-40, and a paperback novel so swollen with moisture that the pages had fused into a solid block. The air inside smelled like mildew and old fabric and the faint sweet rot that wood gets when water has been working on it for longer than anyone has been paying attention. It was a wreck, but it was floating, and it was hers. Lena set her bags on the table. She stood in the middle of the cabin and turned slowly, a full rotation, taking it all in. She could feel the boat moving beneath her. A gentle rocking, barely perceptible, caused by the small wake of something moving through the water outside. The walls were close enough to touch on both sides without extending her arms fully. The ceiling was low enough that she could press her palm flat against it. The light coming through the small windows was dim and green-gold and watery, filtered through bayou water and Spanish moss. The kind of light that doesn't illuminate so much as it softens, turning every surface into something gentler than it actually is. Something about it felt right. She couldn't explain it and didn't try. Maybe it was the rocking the floor moving beneath her, like something alive, something breathing. Maybe it was the smallness, the containedness, every surface within arm's reach, every corner visible, the whole world reduced to a space she could comprehend and control. Whatever it was, she felt it, the way a key feels when it turns in a lock. You didn't know was there. A small mechanical click and alignment of tumblers. And then the door opens and behind it is a room that was waiting for you before you knew it existed. She slept on the floor that night in her sleeping bag, the rotted mattress shoved against the wall. The bayou outside was alive with sounds she had never heard before. An orchestra of unfamiliar instruments playing in an unfamiliar key. Frogs in layered chorus, their calls overlapping in rhythms too complex to follow. Owls calling from the cypresses, the sound low and round and hollow, like someone blowing across the mouth of a bottle. The slow lap of water against the steel hull, regular and unhurried, the heartbeat of the bayou. And once a splash, heavy and sudden, close to the boat, that might have been a large fish, or might have been an alligator, and was probably best left unidentified. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the bayou breathe around her, feeling the boat rock beneath her. The sleeping bag warmed the floor hard. The cabin dark except for the green-gold light filtering through the small windows, which never went fully dark. Because the bayou never went fully dark. There was always some light coming from somewhere. Moonlight, starlight, the bioluminescence of things she couldn't see. And at some point, the fear stopped. Not all at once, not with a conscious decision, but gradually the way your eyes adjust to darkness. One moment, you can't see anything, and the next moment you can see everything, and you can't identify the exact instant when the change occurred. The unfamiliar sounds became familiar. The rocking became a rhythm. The darkness became a room. And Lena stopped feeling afraid and started feeling held. She woke at dawn. The light through the windows was silver and blue. The frogs had stopped. The birds had started a different orchestra, a different key, higher and faster and more competitive, each voice trying to be heard above the others. Then the cabin door opened. Declan stood on the deck in the morning light with 2 cups of coffee and a paper bag stained with grease. Beignets, place down the road, best in Terrebonne Parish, which means best anywhere. You like coffee? Lena took the coffee. They sat on the dock with their legs hanging over the edge, the warm water 2 feet below their shoes, and they ate beignets that were hot and sweet and dusted with powdered sugar, that got on their fingers and their shirts and their faces. And they drank coffee that was strong and dark and tasted like the opposite of everything that had happened to Lena in the last 2 weeks. Declan talked about what needed to happen. The list was long. Hull needed patching, sanding, repainting. Cabin needed gutting and rebuilding from the framing out. Plumbing was non-existent. Electrical was suspect at best, dangerous at worst. Propane system was a fire hazard. Bilge pump was seized solid. 6 months if you do it right, maybe longer. You can stay on her while you work, but it's going to be rough. I can do rough. Declan nodded. He finished his beignet, licked the sugar off his thumb, and stood up. We start with the bilge. The bilge. The lowest point. The place where everything collects water debris, forgotten objects, the residue of years. She lifted the hatch in the cabin floor and looked down into the dark space beneath. 6 inches of black water, opaque smelling of rust and mud, and the particular metallic sweetness of stagnant water in a steel container. She picked up her coffee can, now empty of bills and repurposed as a baler, and she began scooping the water out and dumping it over the side. Scoop and dump. Scoop and dump. Her back bent in the cramped space, her knees aching against the cabin floor. The water cold on her hands and forearms. 2 hours of scooping, 2 hours of slow, repetitive, unglamorous work. When the water was out, she lay on her stomach on the cabin floor and pointed her flashlight into the bilge. The beam moved across the steel bottom, picking up rust and sediment and the skeleton of something small. A mouse, maybe, or a rat. And then it hit something else. Something square and heavy and deliberate. A wooden footlocker. Old. The kind of footlocker that soldiers used to carry their belongings to war and back if they came back. Brass corners tarnished green and black. Leather straps dry but intact. A heavy padlock rusted shut, the keyhole packed with corrosion. And beneath the footlocker, a wooden platform, a shelf really built up from the bottom of the bilge on short legs to keep the footlocker above the waterline. Whoever had put it there had planned it, had measured the depth, had built the platform to the right height, had cared deeply and specifically about keeping whatever was inside that footlocker dry. Lena stared at it for a long time, the flashlight steady in her hand, the beam illuminating the brass corners and the leather straps and the rusted lock. Then she pulled herself up from the cabin floor and went to find Declan. Declan stood at the edge of the hatch and looked down into the bilge where the footlocker sat on its wooden platform, and his face did something Lena hadn't seen before. It went still, completely still. The way a man's face goes when he recognizes something he wasn't expecting to see again. He knelt beside the opening, one knee on the cabin floor, and studied the footlocker without touching it. He stayed like that for nearly a minute, breathing through his nose, his beard moving slightly with each exhale. Harlan Thibodaux was an interesting man. His voice had changed, quieter. The gravel smoothed out of it, replaced by something that sounded almost like reverence. 3 tours in Vietnam, Marine Corps. Came home in '72 and never talked about what happened over there. Not to me, not to anyone I know of. Bought this boat in '79 for $400. Lived on it from that day until the day he died. Worked as a diesel mechanic at the boatyard in Houma. Good with engines. Good with anything that had parts and a logic to it. Saved everything he earned. Spent almost nothing. People used to wonder where his money went. Nobody asked because Harlan wasn't the kind of man you ask questions to. Not because he was mean, because he was private in a way that made privacy feel like a wall you couldn't see but could definitely feel. He paused, looked at Lena. I think you just found where the money went. They pulled the footlocker out of the bilge together, one on each side of the leather straps, lifting it through the hatch and setting it on the cabin floor. It was heavier than it looked. Not the weight of wood alone, but the dense compressed weight of metal packed tight inside an enclosed space. Lena ran her hand across the lid. The wood was dark, some kind of hardwood she couldn't identify, oiled rather than varnished, and the oil had preserved it against the damp. The brass corners were green-black but solid beneath the patina. The leather straps were stiff but unbroken. Declan handed her a hacksaw. Your boat, your footlocker. You should be the one to open it. Lena set the blade against the padlock's shackle and began cutting. The rust was thick, but the steel beneath was old and relatively soft, and the hacksaw bit through it in about 4 minutes of steady back and forth. The lock fell to the cabin floor with a dull metallic sound. Not a clang, more like a thud, the sound of something heavy finally letting go. She unbuckled the leather straps. She lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had been folded carefully and tucked around the contents like a blanket around a sleeping child, were bags. Small cloth bags, the kind made from canvas duck, each one tied shut with cotton twine and labeled with a small cardboard tag attached to the twine. The tags were handwritten in ink that had faded from black to brown to something barely visible, and each tag bore a single notation, a year. The earliest tag read 1979. The latest read 2018. Between them, arranged in chronological order from bottom to top, were 38 bags representing 38 years of a man's life minus 1985 and 1992, which were absent for reasons Harlan Thibodaux had taken with him when he died. Lena lifted the first bag, 1979, and felt the weight settle into her palm, heavy for its size. She untied the twine and opened the mouth of the bag and poured its contents onto the cabin floor. Coins, silver coins. Not modern quarters and dimes, but older coins, the kind that carried weight and history in their metal Walking Liberty $half, Morgan silver dollars. Mercury dimes with the winged cap that wasn't really mercury at all. But Liberty in a Phrygian cap, which Lena knew because Emmett had a coin collection in the display case at the marine supply store and had taught her to identify them on slow Saturday afternoons. The coins were tarnished but solid, their design still sharp beneath the oxide layer, and they clinked against each other on the cabin floor with the particular sound that silver makes cleaner and higher than the sound of copper or nickel. A sound that carries. She opened the second bag. More coins plus folded paper currency bills doubled over and bound with rubber bands that had long since lost their elasticity and crumbled at the touch, leaving the bills to unfold like small paper wings. The third bag was all quarters rolls and rolls of quarters packed so tight the bag had the shape and density of a brick. The fourth was mixed coins and bills, silver and copper, old and less old. The fifth was dimes only, Mercury dimes and Roosevelt dimes, hundreds of them. A sound like a tiny avalanche when they spilled. Each bag contained what Harlan Thibodaux had saved in that particular year. Some bags were heavy, some were light. The bag for 1981 weighed almost nothing. A few silver coins and 2 folded dollar bills, the sum total of what a diesel mechanic in Terrebonne Parish could set aside during a recession year, when work was scarce and the price of fuel oil made everything else more expensive. The bag for 2003 was so full, the canvas had stretched at the seams, packed tight with rolled bills and tubes of quarters, and a small velvet pouch containing 5 gold American Eagle coins that caught the cabin light and threw it back in a color that didn't belong in a rusted houseboat on a bayou in southern Louisiana. It took 2 days to count everything. Declan helped. He brought a kitchen scale from his house, and they weighed the silver coins by type to estimate value. Declan knew a coin dealer in Thibodaux, a retired jeweler named Fontenoy, who drove out to the dock on the second afternoon in a Lincoln Town car that looked as out of place on the dirt road as a yacht in a drainage ditch. Fontenoy examined the silver coins with a loupe and a scale and gave fair assessments without trying to buy. Declan had told him not to. And Fontenoy respected Declan the way most people in Terrebonne Parish respected Declan, which was completely and without negotiation. The final count verified twice written on the back of a hardware store receipt in Declan's blocky handwriting, $48,200. $48,200. 40 years of a quiet man's quiet discipline, folded and rolled and bagged and labeled and hidden in the bilge of a houseboat that he had bought for $400 and lived on until his heart stopped and the Coast Guard found him 3 days later in his bunk with the radio still on. But the money was not the last thing in the footlocker. Below the final bag, the 2018 bag thin containing only a few bills. The savings of a man who was 80 years old and knew he was running out of time to save. There were 2 more objects. An American flag folded into the tight ceremonial triangle that military families recognize immediately. The blue field and white stars showing the red stripes hidden inside the folds. The whole package no larger than a hardcover book. And beneath the flag, a sealed envelope. White legal size, the flap glued shut and yellowed with age. On the front, in the same faded handwriting as the bag tag's 5 words, "To whoever finds this." Lena held the envelope for a long time before opening it. She sat on the cabin floor with the counted money in neat piles around her, and the empty cloth bags stacked beside the footlocker, and the flag on her lap. And she held the envelope and looked at the handwriting, and tried to imagine the hand that had written it. An old hand, she thought the handwriting shaky but deliberate. Each letter formed with the care of someone who did not write often, but wanted to be understood when he did. She imagined Harlan Thibodaux sitting at the same table where she had eaten beignets that morning, writing this letter by lamplight, knowing it might not be found for years, knowing it might not be found at all, writing it anyway. Because the alternative, leaving nothing, disappearing completely, letting 40 years of solitary life on a bayou evaporate like morning fog, was something he refused to accept. She slid her finger under the flap. The glue cracked. She pulled out a single sheet of paper, lined, torn from a composition notebook covered on both sides with small, careful handwriting. Harlan wrote the way he apparently lived, without waste. He was born in Cocody, Louisiana in 1948. He enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1966 when he was 18 and served 3 tours in a war that he referred to only as "over there," never by its name, as if naming it would give it a permanence in the letter that he had spent decades trying to deny it in his mind. He came home in 1972 with everything he had taken with him: his body, his name, his discharge papers, and nothing that he had taken with him. Whatever had been inside Harlan Thibodaux before 1966 did not come back from the jungles, and the things he saw there, and what returned in its place was something harder, quieter, and more alone. He could not live in houses. He could not live in towns. He could not live among people who slept easily and ate without thinking, and walked through their days as if the ground beneath them was solid and permanent rather than thin and temporary, and liable to open up without warning. The only place he could breathe was on the water. The only space small enough to control was a boat. He bought the houseboat in 1979 from a shrimper's widow in Du Lac for $400 and a promise to take care of it. And he kept both halves of the deal, the money and the promise, for the rest of his life. He worked at the boatyard. He came home to the houseboat. He read books about the ocean even though he never went to the ocean. He fed the herons that stood in the shallows near his dock. He had a dog, once the letter didn't say the dog's name, who lived on the boat with him for 14 years and was buried in the cypress grove behind the marina when he died. After the dog, Harlan didn't get another one. Some losses teach you not to try again, and some teach you that trying again is the only thing worth doing. And Harlan had apparently learned the first lesson from the dog and never unlearned it. Each year he put aside what he could. Good years more, bad years less. He never skipped a year except twice 1985 when he was hospitalized for 3 months with pneumonia and nearly died. And 1992 when the boatyard closed for 6 months after Hurricane Andrew, and there was no work and no money. And he ate rice and canned beans and caught fish from the dock and waited for the world to reassemble itself, which it eventually did the way the world always does after storms, slowly and incompletely. The letter ended with a paragraph that Lena read 3 times each time, more slowly than the last, each time feeling the words settle deeper into the place where her mother's note already lived. If you found this footlocker, you came aboard my boat for a reason. Maybe you need a place to stay. Maybe you are trying to build something. Maybe you are just lost. I have been all of those things. I hope this helps. The boat is a good boat. She carried me a long way without ever leaving the dock. There are boats like that. There are lives like that. Take care of her. Signed, Harlan Thibodaux, May 2018. Lena folded the letter along its original creases and slid it back into the envelope. She sat on the deck in the mid-morning light with the bayou spread out before her cypress trees, casting long reflections on water, so still it looked solid, and she did not cry. But her throat tightened, and her eyes burned, and she pressed the heels of her hands against her closed lids and breathed and felt the weight of 3 absences settle onto her. At once her mother, sudden and without goodbye, her father slow, and with too many silent goodbyes. And now Harlan Thibodaux, a man she had never met who had left her everything he had because he had no one else to leave it to. And because he believed that whoever found his footlocker deserved it simply by virtue of having come aboard. 3 people gone, 3 different kinds of gone, and each of them had left something behind for her, a note in a folder in a closet, a footlocker in a bilge, as if the dead could see the living more clearly than the living could see themselves. She reached into her wallet and took out the scrap of notebook paper she had carried for 8 years. She unfolded it carefully. The creases, soft and dark from years of handling the blue ink, faded, but still legible. Lena will find her water. She placed the note inside the envelope with Harlan's letter. 2 messages from 2 people who had never met, never known each other, existed separated by geography and generation and circumstance, joined now inside a yellowed envelope on a houseboat in the bayou. Both saying the same thing in different words, both pointing her toward the same place, both trusting her to arrive. Declan drove her to the Houma branch of First National the following morning. He waited in the truck with the engine off and the windows down, reading a marine parts catalog, while Lena carried the money inside in 2 paper grocery bags. Margot, the branch manager, a Cajun woman in her early 50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain, processed the deposit with professional calm until Lena showed her the letter. Margot read it slowly, her lips moving slightly, the reading glasses sliding down her nose. When she finished, she took the glasses off and looked at Lena with an expression that had no professional distance left in it. Keep that boat, good chair. Harlan was a fine man, quiet but fine. Yelena deposited the money and kept the letter and kept a separate mental accounting from that day forward. Harlan's money for the boat, her own remaining $1,130 from the Folgers can for food and daily needs. The cash she had brought from Mississippi would carry her about 3 months if she was careful, and Lena had been careful her entire life. The work began the same week. Declan's tow system, a hand-crank winch bolted to a railroad tie sunk vertically into the bank, pulled the houseboat out of the water and up onto a set of heavy wooden cradles in the yard behind the shop. The hull emerged from the bayou, like a creature surfacing from a long sleep, weeds trailing from the bottom barnacles in gray clusters along the waterline, and the full extent of the rust visible now in the unforgiving daylight. worse than she had estimated from the dock. The waterline was a continuous band of deep corrosion, the steel thinned to half its original gauge in places. Below the waterline, two old patches sheet metal screwed over holes with machine screws and bedded in some kind of caulk that had long since turned to powder, held on through stubbornness and habit, rather than any structural integrity. Lena started with the grinder. An angle grinder with a flap disc borrowed from Declan's shop plugged into the single outdoor outlet on a 50-foot extension cord that barely delivered enough amperage to keep the disc spinning at full speed. She worked from bow to stern, portside, first pressing the spinning disc against the hull and watching the rust disintegrate into a shower of orange-brown sparks and powder that covered her safety glasses and her respirator mask, and her hair, and her clothes, and the ground beneath her feet. The noise was enormous, a high metallic scream that bounced off the water and the trees and came back at her from every direction. She wore earplugs, but her ears still rang at night when she crawled into her sleeping bag on the cabin floor. Her shoulders burned, her forearms cramped. The vibration of the grinder traveled through her wrists and up into her elbows, and settled into her joints like a low, persistent hum that didn't stop even when she put the grinder down. Some days she could barely lift her arms above her waist by evening. She kept going. Day after day, section by section, the rust came off and the bare steel appeared beneath its silver gray in the morning light, warm copper in the late afternoon sun, alive in a way that rust is not alive. After the grinding came the acid wash, phosphoric acid painted onto the bare steel with a brush, converting the remaining traces of iron oxide into iron phosphate, a stable, inert compound that would bond with the primer coat and provide a foundation for the paint system. The acid smelled sharp and chemical and made her eyes water even through the safety glasses. She worked in sections painting the acid on and letting it react for 20 minutes until the steel turned dark gray-black, then rinsing with fresh water and drying with rags. Then the epoxy, marine-grade two-part mixed on a scrap of plywood with a putty knife until the resin and hardener became a single uniform color. Declan coached from his lawn chair by the shop door, a beer in his hand, watching her work with the particular attention of a man who was teaching without appearing to teach. Like mixing peanut butter and jelly for a sandwich. Mix until it sits where you put it and stays. She troweled the thickened epoxy into the worst spots. The deep pits where rust had eaten craters into the steel, the edges of the old patches where the metal had thinned to paper. She feathered the edges with a sanding block until each repair blended into the surrounding surface, invisible to the eye and smooth to the hand. 2 coats of epoxy barrier primer over the entire hull, rolling it on with a foam roller, in long even strokes, the primer going on amber and drying to a hard matte gray. Then 3 coats of marine enamel. The paint man at the marine supply store in Houma, a sun-darkened Cajun in his 60s, who had been mixing custom marine paint for 3 decades and could match a color from memory, the way a musician can tune a string by ear, looked at Lena when she walked in and didn't ask what color she wanted. He studied her face for a moment, turned to his mixing station, and came back 5 minutes later with a gallon of paint so dark blue it was nearly black. Lena took the can outside, pried the lid off with a screwdriver, dipped a brush and drew a single stripe across the bare primer on the bow of the hull. She stepped back. The color settled into the steel like it had always been there, the color of deep water at night, the color of dreamless sleep, the color of safety. 3 coats, each one deepening the blue, darkening it, giving it a luster. That steel should not have, but did, the way a rough stone can take a polish that transforms it into something you want to hold in your hand. When the 3rd coat dried, the hull gleamed in the Bayou sunlight like the flank of a whale surfacing, dark, smooth, alive. That hull consumed 5 weeks. Declan stood beside her in the yard on the day she rolled the final coat. 35 years fixing boats. I've never seen anyone do hull work that clean on their first build. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. And then the cabin. And it was in the middle of the cabin work in the 5th month, with the walls framed and the marine plywood sheathing half installed, and the roof joists laid but not yet decked, that the weather turned. The tropical storm made landfall 200 miles to the southwest, a disorganized system that the forecasters had given even odds of dissipating before it reached the coast. It didn't dissipate. It tightened and accelerated and swung northeast, tracking directly over Terrebonne Parish with sustained winds of 65 miles per hour, and rain that fell not in drops, but in sheet-solid curtains of water that reduced visibility to zero and turned the bayou from a placid mirror into a churning brown torrent. Lena and Declan had 36 hours of warning. They pulled the houseboat as far up the bank as the winch would allow. They lashed it to 4 deadman anchors with heavy nylon line. They tarped the open cabin. With the largest tarp, Declan owned a 30 by 40 blue poly tarp that they stretched over the joists and tied down with bungee cords and sandbags. The storm hit at 2 in the morning. Lena lay in Declan's shop on a cot he kept for late-night engine jobs, listening to the wind find every gap in the metal walls and scream through them, listening to the rain hammer the roof, with a sound like gravel being poured from a great height, listening to trees crack and fall in the cypress grove behind the marina, each one a deep percussive boom followed by a long tearing sound as the branches dragged through the canopy of their neighbors on the way down. She didn't sleep. She lay on the cot with her arms at her sides and her eyes open and listened to the storm try to take apart everything she had spent 5 months building. By noon the next day it was over. The rain stopped. The wind dropped to a whisper. The bayou was brown and swollen, riding 3 feet higher than normal debris, floating in slow circles branches. Leaves a plastic cooler. Someone's dock section ripped free and traveling downstream like a raft. Lena walked out of the shop and around the corner of the building and looked at her boat. The hull was fine. Steel and epoxy and marine enamel do not care about tropical storms. The dark blue surface was streaked with mud and leaf debris, but undamaged, unscratched, as impervious to the wind and rain as it would have been to a garden hose. The hull was the part of the boat that Lena had finished, and the part she had finished had held. The cabin was not fine. The tarp had torn free sometime during the night the bungee cords had held, but the grommets had ripped through the poly material, and the wind had peeled the tarp away like skin from a blister. Without the tarp, the open cabin had taken the full force of 18 hours of horizontal rain. The marine plywood she had spent 3 weeks cutting and fitting and screwing into place, each panel measured twice cut, once edges sealed with epoxy before installation, was warped. Water had pooled in the spaces between the framing members and soaked the plywood from the backside where the epoxy seal was thinnest, and the panels had begun to swell and cup and pull away from the screws that held them to the frames. The closed-cell foam insulation she had pressed into the cavities between the studs was torn in places where the wind had gotten underneath it. 3 weeks of careful work, ruined in 18 hours. Lena stood in the middle of the damaged cabin, her boots in an inch of standing water, and looked at the warped plywood and the torn insulation, and the joists that were now exposed to the sky because the roof decking hadn't been installed yet. She calculated. Replacement plywood roughly $600, new insulation $200, hardware and fasteners another $100. 3 weeks of labor to redo what she had already done once. The money in her bank account, Harlan's money, was not infinite. Each expense drew the balance lower. Each setback pushed the timeline longer. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice that sounded like the reasonable, practical, exhausted part of herself suggested that perhaps this was a sign. Sell the boat. Take whatever money remained. Move to Baton Rouge or New Orleans. Get a job. Rent an apartment. Live a life that didn't depend on the structural integrity of steel and wood and the whims of a subtropical atmosphere that could undo months of work in a single night. She sat on the wet cabin floor with her knees drawn up and her back against the one wall that had survived intact, and she considered it. Seriously. The way you consider jumping into cold water, not because you want to, but because you're calculating whether the shock will kill you or wake you up. Then she leaned forward and pulled the footlocker out from under the bunk frame where she kept it. The footlocker was dry. The brass corners were wet on the outside, but the interior was sealed oilcloth lining tight joints Harlan's careful construction holding after 40 years and a tropical storm. She opened the lid. She reached past the flag and the envelope and found the bag she was looking for. The 1981 bag, the lightest one. The one that held almost nothing, a few silver coins, 2 paper dollars, the accumulated savings of a year, when the economy contracted and the work dried up, and a man living alone on a houseboat in the Bayou had almost nothing to put aside. Almost nothing. But not nothing. Harlan had still tied the bag, still written the year on the tag, still placed it in the footlocker with the others in sequence in order part of the unbroken chain that stretched from 1979 to 2018. He had not skipped 1981. He had not decided that a bad year didn't count. He had acknowledged it, recorded it, and moved on to 1982, which was heavier. There are years you survive by doing less, not by doing nothing, by doing less. Lena put the bag back. She closed the footlocker. She stood up, walked to the shop, borrowed Declan's pry bar, and started pulling the warped plywood off the cabin framing. The second time was better than the first. Not faster, slower actually, because Lena rebuilt with the storm in mind. She bolted the roof deck to the joist with through bolts instead of screws, each bolt passing through the decking and the joist and a steel backing plate on the underside. She added hurricane straps at every joist-to-header connection, galvanized steel brackets that locked the wooden members together, so the wind couldn't lift the roof without taking the walls with it. And the walls couldn't go without taking the hull. And the hull wasn't going anywhere because it weighed 4 tons and was made of 1/4-inch steel plate. She applied epoxy to both sides of every plywood panel before installation, sealing the wood completely front and back and edges so that water could not enter from any direction. She doubled the insulation in the areas where the wind had torn it free, using spray foam in addition to the rigid boards, filling every gap and seam until the cabin walls were airtight. Declan watched her work from his usual position by the shop door. When she finished the last hurricane strap and climbed down from the roof, he tipped his beer toward her without standing up. First time you build a boat, you build it pretty. Second time, you build it to last. You just learned the most expensive lesson in boat building, and you didn't pay for it with a sinking. 2 weeks after the storm repairs were complete, a white pickup truck that Lena had never seen before pulled into the gravel lot outside Declan's shop. The man who stepped out was in his mid-50s trim, with salt and pepper hair combed neatly, and a collared shirt tucked into pressed khakis, the kind of outfit that looked deliberately chosen to communicate respectability. He walked to the dock with the careful steps of someone unfamiliar with uneven ground, looking at the houseboat with the dark blue hull and the half-finished cabin with an expression that Lena couldn't read from where she stood on the deck with a caulk gun in her hand. "I'm looking for the young lady who bought Harlan Thibodaux's boat." His voice was polite, practiced. The voice of a man who made his living with numbers and knew how to arrange words the way he arranged figures, precisely with the conclusion already determined before the sentence began. Lena set the caulk gun down. She climbed off the boat and walked down the dock, and stood in front of him with her work boots and her epoxy-stained jeans and her hair pulled back under a bandana that had once been red and was now the color of old brick. "I'm Lena Calloway, Virgil Thibodaux." He extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief and told her nothing. "I'm Harlan's nephew, well, second cousin, technically. His mother and my grandmother were sisters. I live in Baton Rouge. I'm a CPA. He paused as if the credentials were part of the argument. "I understand you found some money on the boat." The bayou behind Lena was still. A heron stood in the shallows 30 yards out, motionless, one leg lifted, frozen, in the eternal patience of a predator that knows the fish will come eventually. Declan had emerged from the shop and stood in the doorway, not speaking, not approaching. Just present the way a man is present when he wants another person to know they're not alone without making a production of it. "I found a footlocker." Harlan left it for whoever came aboard. Virgil's smile was thin, professional. I appreciate that interpretation, but legally an estate's assets pass to next of kin when there's no will, and I'm the only kin Harlan had. There's a letter. Virgil's smile didn't waver, but something behind it shifted the faintest recalculation, a number that didn't balance. A letter isn't a will. No, but it says what he wanted. Lena turned and walked back to the boat. She climbed aboard, went into the cabin, and came back with the envelope. She held it out to Virgil without ceremony, without explanation, without the slightest tremor in her hand. Virgil took the envelope. He opened it. He read the letter standing on the dock in the mid-afternoon sunlight with the bayou behind him, and the heron still frozen in the shallows, and Declan still standing in the doorway of the shop with his arms folded across his chest. He read it slowly. His lips didn't move. His face didn't change. But his eyes stayed on one passage longer than the others, going back over it twice, 3 times, as if he were checking his arithmetic and finding an answer he hadn't expected. He looked up from the letter. The professional smile was gone. In its place was something more complicated, not quite shame, not quite acceptance, but the expression of a man who has just been confronted with evidence that contradicts a position he had committed to before entering the room. He says he has no family. He says he has no one to leave it to. The distinction landed. Virgil looked at the letter again, then at the boat, then at Lena. He was seeing, perhaps for the first time, the full picture. The dark blue hull that had been rust-red 2 months ago, the cabin framing rising from the deck in clean geometric lines. The tools organized on the dock. The stack of marine plywood waiting to be cut. The call gun on the deck where she had set it down to talk to him. He was seeing a 19-year-old girl who had taken a derelict houseboat and was turning it into something with her own hands, day by day, board by board, the way his cousin had turned 40 years of wages into 38 cloth bags in a brass-cornered footlocker. The sound of a cane on wooden planking. Nolan, 80 years old, coming down the dock from the parking lot with the deliberate pace of a man who had learned decades ago that speed was not the same as purpose. He walked past Virgil without acknowledging him and stopped beside Lena and looked at the boat with the satisfied expression of someone reviewing work he had been watching for months. Then he turned to Virgil, and his voice carried the flat authority of a man who has outlived his patience for pretense. I've known Harlan since 1955. We were 7 years old, swam in the same bayou, caught the same crawfish, went to the same school until he dropped out in 10th grade and enlisted. He didn't contact his family after he came home from the war. Wasn't because he hated anyone, was because he couldn't figure out how to be the person he'd been before he went. And he decided it was easier to stop trying than to keep failing at it. That was his choice. Not a good one, maybe, but his. Nolan shifted his weight on the cane. That footlocker sat under the floor of this boat for 40 years. Harlan put it there for the next person who'd live aboard, not for the person who'd sell the contents and drive back to Baton Rouge. The heron in the shallows chose that moment to strike a sudden downward thrust of the long neck, a splash, and then the head came back up with a small silverfish crosswise in the beak. The fish caught the sunlight as the heron tilted its head and swallowed. Virgil folded the letter carefully along its original creases and placed it back in the envelope and handed the envelope to Lena. He looked at the boat one more time. He looked at her hands, epoxy under the nails, calluses on the palms, a fresh cut across the left index finger, where a chisel had slipped that morning, already scabbing, already healing. He nodded once, the way men nod when they have decided something they know is right, even if it costs them what they came for. Take care of the boat. He shook her hand again. Then he walked back to his white truck and drove away, and the dust from the gravel lot settled slowly in the warm air. And Lena stood on the dock, holding the envelope and feeling something she hadn't felt before. Not relief exactly, and not victory, but the particular solidity that comes from having been challenged, and having stood without flinching, and having been recognized by a stranger as someone whose claim was earned rather than inherited. Nolan lowered himself onto a piling at the edge of the dock, his cane across his knees. He watched the white truck disappear around the bend in the road. Then, without looking at Lena, in a voice that was quieter than before, almost private, he offered a small piece of Harlan that he had been carrying for a long time. Harlan had a dog, kept it on the boat 14 years, named Dauphin after the island. When Dauphin died, Harlan buried him in the cypress grove behind the marina, marked the spot with a white stone round about the size of a softball. He never got another dog after that. If you want to find the stone, it's north of the biggest cypress, under the moss. Lena wrote it down in the small notebook she kept under her pillow. The notebook where she recorded measurements and material lists and the slowly accumulating fragments of a man's life told to her by the people who had known him. The cabin took another 6 weeks after the storm repairs. Lena worked from dawn to dark 6 days a week, resting on Sundays, not because she observed any religious practice, but because Declan insisted. Declan's insistence, delivered quietly and without explanation, had the force of a natural law. The walls went up marine plywood over cedar planking, the cedar's natural oils adding a layer of rot resistance and filling the cabin with a scent that was clean and sharp, and entirely unlike the mildew that had greeted her on her first night aboard. The roof was sealed with rolled roofing membrane over the bolted plywood deck, and a small skylight was set into the center, a 12-inch acrylic dome that Lena had found at a marine salvage yard in Morgan City, scratched on the outside but clear on the inside. And when the sun hit it at the right angle, a column of warm light dropped through it and landed on the exact spot where the folding table sat, illuminating whatever was on the table. A plate, a book, a set of plans, like a small private spotlight. New propane stove with proper venting, and a pressure regulator, and a shut-off valve, and a CO detector mounted on the ceiling above it. Because propane is heavier than air and sinks, and CO is lighter than air and rises, and both will kill you. And the detector needs to be where the CO goes, not where the propane goes, which is a distinction that saves lives and that Emmett had drilled into her on a Tuesday afternoon 2 years ago in Mississippi. Marine-grade electrical cable, throughout color-coded, run through protective conduit connecting the solar panel on the roof to the battery bank in a sealed box under the bunk, to the LED lights and the bilge pump and the fresh water pump and the single USB outlet where Lena charged the phone she almost never used. 30-gallon freshwater tank with a hand pump at the galley sink. Composting head behind a curtain in the corner, which was not glamorous but was functional and didn't require a holding tank or a pump-out station, which meant Lena would never need to depend on marina infrastructure she didn't have. The furniture she built herself from cedar and pine. A bench seat along the port wall that doubled as storage lift the seat, and there were compartments for tools, rope spare parts. A table on a hinge that folded flat against the starboard wall when she needed floor space, held horizontal by a single removable leg that stored in a clip under the bench. A bunk at the bow fitted precisely to the narrowing hull with drawers beneath for clothes. And bookshelves on every available wall surface, because the boat would fill with books, and the books would be the ballast that kept her steady. Sach ki tuat biensak chim va kay Bayou bo Joseph Conrad. They do kun Moby Dick bia memson, ma me ko tung iu. She kept Harlan's footlocker, polished the brass corners, oiled the leather straps, placed it under the bunk where she could see it every morning when she made the bed. Inside she kept the flag and the envelope containing Harlan's letter, and her mother's note, and the 1979 bag empty the first year, the year he bought the boat, a marker for the beginning. Month 8. The cabin was finished. The boat went back in the water on a Tuesday morning in early April, 8 months and 6 days after Lena had first stepped aboard. Declan operated the winch. The cable sang under tension as the cradles tilted and the hull slid down the bank inch by inch, the dark blue paint catching the morning light and throwing it back in long streaks of indigo and black. The waterline touched first a thin bright seam where the anti-fouling paint met the topside enamel, and then the hull settled into the bayou with a sound that was not a splash but something quieter, more intimate, the sound of two surfaces that belong together finally meeting. The water rose around the hull and found its level, and the boat floated sitting exactly where Lena had calculated she would sit, low stable, the deck 18 inches above the waterline, the cabin windows just high enough to catch the breeze off the water without catching the spray. From the outside, the boat was unrecognizable. Dark blue hull, gleaming cedar cabin, warm in the sunlight, new hardware bright against the wood. But the bones were still Harlan's boat. Same hull shape, same dock, same way of sitting low and steady in the water. Lena had not transformed it. She had restored it. There was a difference, and the difference mattered. But finished things have a particular silence to them. A project in progress fills the hours with its demands. The next cut, the next coat, the next problem to solve. A completed project leaves a vacuum. Lena had organized her days around the boat for 8 months. Now the boat was done, and the days were shapeless, and shapelessness was its own kind of threat. Not dramatic, not dangerous, but persistent, like a slow leak in a hull you can't find. The first week after the launch, she cleaned. She organized the tool storage under the bench seat. She alphabetized the books on the shelves. She adjusted the tension on the dock lines. She calibrated the battery charge controller. She found small tasks the way a person finds reasons to stay busy when the alternative is sitting still with questions they don't have answers to yet. The second week, the Bayou answered for her. Not with a revelation or a sign, but with a knock on the hull at 6 in the morning. Odette's knuckles against the steel, a sound like a muffled bell, followed by a voice that carried the particular music of Terrebonne Parish French, threaded through Louisiana English. Wake up, cher, I brought breakfast and I'm not eating alone. Odette had been bringing gumbo on Fridays since the second month of the rebuild. But this was a Tuesday, and she had brought not gumbo but a cast-iron skillet full of shrimp and grits, still hot wrapped in a dish towel, and carried down the dock in both hands like a sacrament. She climbed aboard without waiting for an invitation. Odette did not wait for invitations the way the tide does not wait for permission, and set the skillet on the galley counter, and produced 2 forks from her apron pocket, and handed one to Lena, and began eating standing up, looking around the finished cabin with the critical eye of a woman who had opinions about living spaces, and was not shy about expressing them. You need curtains. Those windows are naked. I have fabric at the restaurant blue check left over from the tablecloth, good cotton. I'll bring it Thursday and we'll sew them on my machine. She chewed, swallowed, pointed her fork at the bookshelves. Too many books about boats. You need a cookbook. I'll bring you mine, the one my grandmother wrote by hand, Cajun recipes going back 4 generations. You'll copy what you want and give it back. Don't get it wet. Lena ate the shrimp and grits and listened to Odette talk and understood that this was not a social call. This was an incorporation. Odette was weaving Lena into the fabric of a community that operated on proximity and reciprocity, and the unspoken assumption that people who lived near each other owed each other something. Not money, not favors, but attention, presence, the willingness to show up with a skillet of shrimp and grits at 6 in the morning. Because you noticed that someone's boat was in the water, and that meant they were staying and staying, meant they were yours now. Odette came back Thursday with the blue check fabric and a portable sewing machine. They made curtains on the dock in the afternoon shade. Odette feeding the fabric through the machine with the speed of someone who had been sewing since childhood. Lena cutting and pinning and learning a skill she had never needed before, and that she now understood she would need for the rest of her life because boats always needed fabric work, and a person who lived on a boat and couldn't sew was like a person who lived in a house and couldn't change a light bulb. The curtains went up that evening. Blue and white check, hemmed clean, hanging from small brass rings on tension rods that Lena had bent from stainless steel wire. When the evening light came through them, the cabin filled with a soft blue-white pattern that moved gently with the breeze of the water, and the cabin stopped looking like a workshop and started looking like a home. Remy appeared 3 days later, He arrived at dawn in his flat-bottomed pirogue, sliding through the cypress roots without a sound. A cooler in the bow and a mesh bag of chicken necks in his lap. He tied up to Lena's dock without asking, and began showing her how to set crawfish traps. Wire mesh cylinders baited with the chicken necks sunk in the shallow water near the bank where crawfish foraged in the mud and leaf litter. The technique was simple, but the knowledge behind it was not where to place the traps relative to the current. How deep, how far from the bank when to check them. What time of day the crawfish moved, and what time they hid. How the water temperature affected their behavior. How the moon phase changed everything in ways that Remy could explain, but not entirely articulate the way a musician can play a song perfectly, but cannot always tell you why a particular note works in a particular place. Within a month, Lena was pulling crawfish every morning at dawn, wading in the shallows in rubber boots, lifting the traps and sorting the catch by size, throwing back the small ones, keeping the keepers in a bucket of fresh water. She boiled them on the propane stove in a stock pot with cayenne pepper and bay leaves and halved lemons and whole heads of garlic and the za'atar Ryan's crab boil that Remy considered essential and Odette considered lazy. But both agreed was better than no seasoning at all. She ate them on the deck in the early morning light, peeling the tails with practiced fingers that had learned the twist and pull from Remy's demonstration and perfected it through repetition, the way she had learned everything by doing it until the doing became invisible and only the result remained. Nolan came by most afternoons, not every afternoon, and never on a schedule, but often enough that Lena began to expect the sound of his cane on the dock boards around 3 o'clock. The slow, deliberate tap of a man who moved at the speed he chose and would not be hurried by anyone or anything, including his own body, which had been trying to slow him down for decades and had mostly failed. He sat on the piling at the end of the dock, the one closest to Lena's boat, and he told her about Harlan. Not everything at once. Nolan parceled it out the way Harlan had parceled his savings into annual bags a little at a time, each portion labeled with the context that gave it meaning. He told her about the woman Harlan had loved before the war, a girl from Dulac named Celine, who had hair the color of Spanish moss in sunlight, which was not gray but gold, a distinction Nolan was particular about. Harlan and Celine had been together from the time they were 15 until the day Harlan shipped out in 1966. She wrote to him for the first year. The letters slowed in the second year. By the third year, she had married a shrimp boat captain from Grand Caillou and moved away, and Harlan learned about it from a letter his mother sent. And he did not blame Celine, and he did not blame the shrimp boat captain, and he did not blame the war, at least not out loud. He simply folded that piece of himself closed. The way you fold a letter back into its envelope carefully along the original creases so that the words are hidden, but the paper remembers their shape. Nolan told her about Harlan's reading habits. He read books about the ocean, Conrad and Melville, and Patrick O'Brien, and Sebastian Junger, and everything Rachel Carson ever wrote, even though he lived on a bayou and had never sailed on the open sea. Lena asked why once, and Nolan thought about it for a long time, watching a pelican dive in the distance before answering. I think he liked knowing there was something bigger than what he could see from the dock. He didn't need to go to it. He just needed to know it was there. She learned that Harlan had carved small wooden birds during the long winter evenings. Herons, egrets, pelicans, kingfishers whittled from driftwood with a pocket knife that he sharpened every Sunday on a whetstone he kept on the galley counter. The birds were scattered across Terrebonne Parish, given away to anyone who admired them. Which was everyone, because they were remarkably good, not crude folk art, but careful, anatomically accurate renderings the feathers suggested by grain and knife angle, the postures caught in mid-motion. Lena had found one in Odette's restaurant on a shelf behind the register. A great blue heron, 8 inches tall, standing on one leg, the detail so fine she could see the individual barbs of the breast feathers where the knife had teased them from the wood. Nolan also told her harder things when enough trust had accumulated between them. He told her about the nightmares, the sound of Harlan shouting in his sleep, that carried across the water. On still nights, words in no language Nolan could identify, sounds that were not speech, but something older and more frightened. He told her about the time Harlan had dismantled the entire engine of his boat during a manic episode that lasted 3 days, pulling every component out and laying them on the dock in rows and then reassembling the entire thing from memory without a manual. And the engine ran better afterward, which was either a testament to his skill or a commentary on the relationship between madness and competence, and Nolan wasn't sure which. Lena wrote it all down. The notebook grew thicker. The portrait of Harlan Thibodaux assembled itself the way a mosaic assembles tile by tile, each piece, meaningless alone, the image emerging only when you step back far enough to see the whole. One afternoon in late May, Lena walked into the cypress grove behind the marina. She had been meaning to do it for weeks, but had kept putting it off the way you postpone visiting a grave, because the postponement is itself a form of respect, an acknowledgement that the visit matters too much to do casually. She followed the path through the trees until she reached the largest cypress. It was enormous. The trunk wider than her arm span, the bark deeply furrowed the roots spreading out in all directions like the buttresses of a cathedral. Spanish moss hung from its lowest branches in curtains so long they touched the ground. She walked north of the trunk, stepping carefully through the leaf litter and the fallen moss scanning the ground. 10 feet from the base, half covered by decomposing leaves and a web of fine roots, she found it. A white stone, smooth roundabout the size of a softball. River stone, probably carried here from somewhere upstream, white as bone against the dark earth. No inscription, no marker. Just the stone placed deliberately with the kind of care that needs no explanation. Lena knelt beside it. She brushed the leaves away. She sat there for several minutes listening to the bayou sounds filtering through the trees. The distant splash of something large, the close buzz of something small. The eternal background percussion of the frogs. She did not speak. She did not leave anything. She simply sat with the stone and the knowledge of what lay beneath it. She stood and walked back to the dock without telling anyone where she had been. Some things you find not to share, but to carry. Lena had been working at Declan's shop since the 3rd month of the rebuild, trading labor for slip fees and workshop access, and the arrangement had evolved without either of them formally acknowledging the evolution. She had started by sweeping floors and organizing inventory. Within a month, she was changing oil and replacing zinc anodes. Within 3 months, she was diagnosing electrical faults with a multimeter and a wiring diagram, and a patience that Declan said reminded him of Emmett, which was the highest compliment in his vocabulary. Within 6 months, she was doing full outboard rebuilds, pulling the lower unit, replacing water pump impellers and seals, checking the gear oil for water intrusion, adjusting the carburetor timing, the ignition. Customers who brought their boats to Declan's shop began asking for her by name. Not many, but enough. The word traveled the way words travel in small bayou communities, from dock to dock, bait shop to gas station, church parking lot to post office counter. The girl living on old Harlan's boat. The one who fixed the Johnson 90 on Pete Arsenault's bay boat when Declan couldn't figure out the misfire. The one who rebuilt the steering cable on the Trosclair Brothers crab boat in 2 hours flat, using parts she fabricated from stock in the shop, because the factory parts were back-ordered for 6 weeks, and the Trosclairs needed to be on the water by Friday. Declan called her into the shop on a Thursday afternoon in June, 8 weeks after the boat went back in the water. The shop was quiet. The last customer had trailered out at 3, and the only sound was the ticking of the metal roof expanding in the heat, and the low hum of the chest freezer, where Declan kept bait and beer in roughly equal proportions. He was sitting in the rolling chair behind the workbench, a beer open on the bench beside a disassembled fuel pump. His reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead. He looked at her the way he looked at a hull. He was assessing carefully without hurry, weighing what he saw against what he knew. I'm 57. My back hurts every morning before I get out of bed. My knees sound like somebody stepping on bubble wrap. I'll work another 3 years, maybe 5, if my spine cooperates, and after that I'm done. I don't have kids. Emmett's never leaving Mississippi, and even if he did, he's 63 and his hands shake on cold mornings. This shop has been here 22 years. I built it from a toolbox and a borrowed trailer. It's not worth much on paper, but it's worth everything on the water, because when your engine dies 3 miles out in the bayou, what matters is not the blue book value of the shop that fixes it, but the fact that the shop exists and the person inside it knows what they're doing. He picked up the beer, drank, set it down. I'm not offering you anything official. I'm not that organized. But I'm asking, do you want to learn how to run this place? Not tomorrow, not next month, gradually. So that when I stop, the shop doesn't stop with me. Lena stood in the doorway with the afternoon light behind her, and the smell of outboard exhaust and penetrating oil and old wood surrounding her. And she looked past Declan through the open bay door at the back of the shop to where the bayou stretched flat and dark under the June sky. Her boat was there at the end of the dock, the dark blue hull and the cedar cabin and the skylight dome catching the sun. The dock lines were cleated in the pattern Emmett had taught her. Figure 8 half hitchtail tucked neat and secure, the kind of knots you tie when you plan to stay. She looked back at Declan. She thought about what he was really asking, which was not whether she could learn to manage a shop. She could, that was just another system. But whether she wanted to build something here in this place, on this water, among these people. She nodded, not because she had the answer fully formed, but because for the first time in her life, someone was looking at her and seeing not damage, not charity, not a cautionary tale, but capability, skill. The accumulated evidence of years of work and learning, and the daily proof that Lena Calloway could take broken things and make them work. Declan was not offering her pity. He was offering her a future built on the premise that she had earned one. The summer deepened. June dissolved into July. The bayou thickened with heat and humidity, the air so heavy with moisture that breathing felt like drinking something warm and faintly green. The cypress trees stood in their dark water and dropped their needles in slow spirals, and the Spanish moss hung motionless in the stillness. Alligators surfaced at dusk, their eyes like amber beads floating on the black water, and slid beneath again without sound. Lena learned to read their presence the way she read a tide chart, by the disturbance they left behind, the ripple that moved against the current, the absence of frogs along a particular stretch of bank. She fell into a rhythm. Mornings on the dock, coffee and crawfish if the traps were good, coffee and toast if they weren't. Days at the shop with Declan learning the business side, now invoicing parts, ordering customer relations. The delicate diplomacy of telling a man that his 40-year-old engine was not worth rebuilding, without making him feel that his judgment was being questioned. Evenings on the boat, reading or writing in the notebook, or sitting on the deck watching the bayou perform its nightly transformation from green to gold to black. Odette came Fridays. Remy came when the crawfish were running. Nolan came when he felt like it, which was most afternoons. And the stories he told about Harlan became fewer as the months passed, not because he was running out of them, but because the ones that remained were heavier and required more trust to deliver. By the end of summer, Lena knew Harlan better than she had known her own father. The thought made her chest ache with a grief that was not for Harlan, but for Hank, for the conversations they might have had if Hank had been able to speak, for the closet full of crayon boats that she had found too late for the man who had loved her in silence for 8 years and died on her birthday, without ever telling her why the drawings mattered to him. But the grief was clean. It didn't poison. It sat beside the other things. She carried the note, the letter, the knowledge of the white stone in the cypress grove, and it became part of the ballast that kept her steady. The way ballast works, not by removing the weight, but by placing it low and center where it does the most good. A late afternoon at the end of September. The first cool front of the season had come through. Overnight, dropping the temperature 15 degrees and clearing the haze from the sky, and the bayou was sharper and more vivid than it had been in months. Every edge defined, every color saturated the cypress trees black-green against a sky so blue it looked painted. Lena sat on the deck of her boat with her legs stretched out and her back against the cabin wall, and a cup of coffee cooling in her hand. The sun was going down behind the trees, and the light was doing what Bayou light does at the end of a clear day. It turned everything gold, then orange, then a deep red purple that lasted only minutes before fading to the blue-gray of dusk. A great blue heron stood in the shallows 30 feet from the boat, one leg up the other planted in the mud, its body absolutely still, its neck curved like a question mark, its yellow eye fixed on a point in the water that only it could see. The heron had been there for 20 minutes. Lena had been watching it for 20 minutes. Neither of them had moved. They were engaged in the kind of mutual observation that is only possible between creatures who have made peace with stillness, who have learned that waiting is not the absence of action, but a form of action so refined that it looks from the outside like nothing at all. She thought about Harlan, a man who bought a houseboat for $400 and lived on it for 40 years and put his savings into cloth bags and carved wooden birds, and buried his dog under a white stone, and wrote a letter to someone he would never meet, because he believed that what he had built, this small, quiet, invisible life on the water, was worth passing on. She thought about her father. The wool sweater she still wore on cool evenings, the smell of him fading from the fibers with each washing, but not yet gone. The folder of crayon boats in his closet, handled so many times the pages had softened at the edges. The distance between love and the expression of love, which in Hank Calloway's case had been the width of a bedroom wall and the depth of 8 years of silence. She thought about her mother, a woman who had seen something in her daughter before the daughter could see it in herself, and had written it down on a scrap of notebook paper and hidden it among crayon boats like a message in a bottle, trusting the current to carry it where it needed to go. Lena reached into the cabin and pulled the footlocker out from under the bunk. She opened the lid, the flag, the envelope, the notebook, the bags. She took out the envelope and removed her mother's note, the scrap of notebook paper she had carried for 8 years. The blue ink faded, the creases deepened by years of folding and unfolding. But the 5 words still legible, still certain, still true. Lena will find her water. She held the note for a moment, feeling its weight, which was almost nothing, and was also everything. Then she reached into the footlocker and took out the 1979 bag. The first bag, the year Harlan bought the boat. The bag had been empty when Lena first opened it. Not a single coin, not a single bill. Just the canvas and the cardboard tag with the year written in fading ink. It was the beginning of the record, the first entry in a 40-year ledger, and it contained nothing. Because in 1979, Harlan had spent everything he had on the boat itself and had nothing left to save. The bag was a marker, a placeholder proof that the counting had begun even though the count was 0. Lena placed her mother's note inside the 1979 bag. She pulled the drawstring closed. She tied it with cotton twine from a spool in Declan's shop. She placed the bag back in the footlocker in its original position at the bottom beneath all the other bags where the first year always goes. The bag was no longer empty. She closed the footlocker. She latched the leather straps. She slid it back under the bunk. And she sat back against the cabin wall and drank her cooling coffee and watched the heron in the shallows. Who had not moved, who was still waiting. Who would wait as long as necessary. Because patience was not a virtue for a heron, but a survival strategy. And the fish would come or it wouldn't. And either way, the heron would be there tomorrow, in the same shallows, watching the water, with an eye that missed nothing. The light faded. The gold became gray. The first stars appeared above the cypress trees, faint and tentative, as if they weren't sure the sky was ready for them. The frogs began their evening chorus, the sound rising from the water, and the banks and the roots and the mud in layers, each species occupying its own frequency. The whole assembly producing a sound that was not music, but was organized the same way in patterns that repeated and varied, and repeated again, endless and reliable, and as old as the water itself. The heron struck. A sudden downward thrust, the long neck uncoiling, the beak piercing the surface and emerging with a flash of silver. A small fish alive and twisting, caught in the grip of a predator that had outlasted it through nothing more than stillness and attention. The heron tilted its head, adjusted the fish and swallowed. Then it lifted from the water with two heavy wing beats. The span of its wings enormous against the darkening sky, its shadow stretching across the bayou, and it flew low over the surface toward the cypress grove and disappeared. Lena watched it go. She sat on the deck of the boat she had bought for $10 and rebuilt with her hands over 8 months on a bayou in southern Louisiana. And the water reflected the sky so perfectly that the boundary between them had vanished, and the boat appeared to float not on water, but in the middle of the air, suspended between two identical heavens, held in place by nothing but its own weight and the dock lines she had tied herself. Somewhere in the cypress grove near a white stone under the biggest tree, the heron landed. Somewhere in the shop, Declan was closing up for the night, the fluorescent lights clicking off one by one. Somewhere in town, Odette was wiping down the tables at her restaurant and planning Friday's gumbo. Somewhere on the bayou, Remy was pulling his last traps of the evening, the crawfish clicking against each other in the mesh. And somewhere on a highway toward Baton Rouge, Virgil Thibodaux was driving home with a letter he would never forget and a claim he would never make. All of them connected to this boat. All of them connected to the man who had lived on it before her. All of them connected to Lena now, the way roots connect to a tree not visible above ground, not dramatic, not announced, but essential. The hidden infrastructure that keeps the whole thing standing. She finished her coffee. The cup was empty and warm in her hands. The frogs sang. The water lapped against the hull in its slow, steady rhythm, the heartbeat of the bayou. The sound she had been listening for her entire life without knowing what it was. Lena Calloway, 19 years old, orphan, $10. A rusted houseboat on a bayou in Terrebonne Parish, Louisiana. That was where it started. And now she sat on the deck of a boat she had rebuilt with her own hands, in a place where people knew her name, doing work that mattered, carrying a footlocker full of cloth bags and a folded flag and a letter from a dead Marine and a note from a dead mother, both of which said the same thing in different words, both of which she had carried to the same place, both of which were true. The best $10 she ever spent. The bayou settled into night around her, and Lena did not move, and she did not need to, because she was already where she was going.